This is the title of my talk, Trauma, Resilience, and Flexible Self-Regulation. I'll begin with this slide. I often begin with this slide. Bad things happen. Now, some of these things are relevant, of course, to what you're dealing with right now, and others up in the upper left, that's more of a weather event that we have in the US. But these are all bad things. These are things that we really don't want to happen. We dread these things happening, and they often have dire consequences. We think of these as traumas. But epidemiological research has shown us very clearly that most people experience at least one event like this, and often several in the course of their lives, which raises the question really what we mean when we say these are traumas. And then, of course, we have the question of resilience and how does that fit in? So these are all really important things to think about, and it's what I focus a lot of my career thinking about. Today, I'll focus on resilience, and I will focus on what I call the three axioms, the three fundamental points about resilience. Resilience is common. Resilience is more than a few key traits. There's more to it than that. And resilience requires flexibility. And I'll go through all three of these during this talk. We'll start with the idea that resilience is common. I like to look at this graphically. When I began my career, this was the state where things are. I began my career now well over 30 years ago, and we had basically what I call a binary model. If we think about this graphically, we have a traumatic event. I use the phrase potentially traumatic events, or PTE, to describe these events. We have a potentially traumatic event, we have time, and we have a continuum of health. So symptoms and distress, however we want to think about that. In a binary model, we have basically two options: PTSD or the absence of PTSD, or whatever other psychopathology we use. PTSD, chronic PTSD, would look something like this over time. If we only have that, though, the binary model, everything else is in the only remaining category, everybody else, I should say, everybody else. And we don't really have a name for that. Non-psychopathology, health, resilience, the name is not perfectly clear. When we look at this graphically, we also realize we don't know much about this group, people who don't develop PTSD. Where are they on this graph? We don't really know, or we did not know until recently. And this is a problem because if we don't understand the absence of pathology, we can't understand psychopathology. When I began my career, I was very interested in this. I was particularly interested in this area on the graph, down near the bottom, where we would see people who go through a potentially traumatic event and have little or no lasting harm. At the time, that was considered rare, and it was also considered in some circles pathological, as if there was something wrong with people who didn't show any enduring harm. So I was very interested in this when I began my career. We're talking 30 years ago. So instead of focusing on this binary approach, I tried to map the heterogeneity, to look at the different types of outcomes people show. And we did this typically by mapping prototypical trajectories. After now many years, this is what we have. If we think of PTSD symptoms, we see a chronic trajectory, which is not PTSD, but chronically elevated symptoms. They overlap a great deal, but they're not 100% the same thing. You can see the prevalence of this pattern. We also see this pattern, acute symptoms, high levels of symptoms initially that gradually go away, gradually abate. And then we see this pattern, kind of like delayed PTSD, although it really more accurately, a person is struggling but getting by and then slowly getting worse. Now, these three patterns, you can see, we know the prevalence of these patterns. We've seen these patterns many times. What about this area over here in the graph that I mentioned earlier? It turns out when we looked, and this is one of the things we did that hadn't been done before, we simply looked, we found that this is where most people were. We identified this trajectory. We call this the resilience trajectory. People may experience a little bit of symptomatology early on, but they otherwise show a stable trajectory of healthy functioning. This is almost always seen in the majority, the most common pattern. In 2004, I had enough data to finally just basically say resilience is common. And this was at the time considered a somewhat radical idea, although luckily it was very well received because the data were piling up to support this. We've since continued to do this work. Here are some of the more recent studies. The studies with an asterisk are from my lab, but other people now use the same approach that we used. You can see on the right some of the types of events. There's combat deployments, spinal cord injury, mass shooting, traumatic injuries, etc. And on the far right, you can see the percentages for each one of these studies. This pattern, this resilience pattern, is always the common pattern. I'll go through these slides somewhat quickly just to make the basic point that this is a common outcome. This was a review that we did recently of 63 trajectory studies using different modeling approaches. We do this computationally, so we use different modeling approaches. And across all these studies, on average, resilience was seen in about 2/3 of the people in the studies. 1/3 then showed one of these other patterns. So there is a lot to work with. There's a lot of difficulties, a lot of people having difficulties. 1 out of 3 is a lot. So we have this interesting divergence. Here's a quick study that is particularly relevant for what you're working with in Ukraine. This is a study we did of US soldiers deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. And here we had data before they were deployed, and then twice at follow-up, about 3 years apart at follow-up. And we plotted these trajectories. Close to 7% showed this pattern, which is essentially chronic PTSD, chronically elevated PTSD. Another 2.2% had elevated symptoms before they deployed for various reasons. But the most interesting finding here is that resilience was very high in this sample. And these are soldiers that are trained to do what they need to do, and resilience tends to be even higher than in the normal population, despite what they're exposed to. This initially was somewhat controversial because it was somewhat challenged the traditional ideas about PTSD in soldiers, but this has now been replicated a number of times. When we have prospective data, that is data before an event and continue with till afterwards, we have much more accurate data. And so we tend to see this high level of resilience in soldiers. So I could show you a lot more data to support this idea, but I'll hope you take me at my word here. We have lots of evidence that resilience is this common pattern. So the next question is, why is that? Why are most people resilient and some not? Here's a common answer. We often see this in websites, in professional journals, in popular ideas as well, that there are a few key traits that determine who will be resilient and who not. I'll argue for you now that that's actually not true. The second point is resilience requires more than a few key traits. It's much more complicated than that. And why do I say that? Well, when we can actually measure correlates of resilience, we find many, many factors, not 3 or 5 or 7. We find 50 or 60. We find a lot of different factors. In this figure, I've color-coded them in blue, the things that we bring to an event, what we have, and what we do before an event. In the magenta color, what happens during the event, and then in the aftermath, in white, what we do or what happens to us afterwards. Each one of these lines can have multiple factors on it, and this is even just a sampling of all these different factors that we find correlate with resilience. How do we make sense of that? This is a very difficult question, and I've thought about this question for most of my career. And I won't go into this in any detail, these different factors, because there are lots of them. But it really begs the question, how do resilient people do this? It gets even more complicated when we look closer. We realize that the effects are small. That's a statistical term. They're small effect sizes, but essentially what it means is that each one of these factors only contributes a little bit to determining who will be resilient. Each one of these factors only moves the needle a little bit. If you have one of these factors, you're a little bit more likely to be resilient. This makes the question even more difficult. I call this the resilience paradox. We tend to think of resilience like this pie on the lower left, where we have nice big fat slices that are the factors we assume make people resilient. If we have these key factors, then we will be resilient, or we can make people resilient. But this is highly idealized. The realistic pie looks more like this. The slices that are explaining resilience are very thin. And even when we have machine learning or some other method where we can look at lots of factors at once, we still see that we often don't explain even half of this pie. So the paradox is that we know all these different correlates, but we still can't reliably or accurately know who will be resilient. Even more important, we don't know how it works. We don't know what the mechanism is. How do people who become resilient utilize all this information? How do they do it? This is really the key question, and this is what I've been devoting myself to for the last 10 or 15 years. We can actually solve this paradox. We can work it out. But if we think about it a little bit, and also we do some interesting research, there's always the research part. But what do we know? First of all, we know that situational challenges vary greatly across events. The challenges that events present us with vary. So coping with a hurricane, which is a weather event in the US, or let's say an earthquake, coping with an earthquake is different than a terrorist attack, which is different than abuse, different than loss, different than a medical emergency or a disease pandemic or a war. All of these events, and there are, of course, as you know, many different kinds of wars and different experiences in wars. All of these different situations present us with dramatically different challenges. We tend to think of trauma as a one category, but in fact, the instances in this category are markedly different. They also differ across time. What we deal with initially is very different than what we deal with later. We might feel shock and confusion initially, numbness. Then we might later start having intrusive thoughts or heightened arousal or nightmares. We then maybe become apprehensive. We start to fear. We start to have undifferentiated fear. We might worry. We have PTSD. We might restrict our activities. So all these different challenges are happening over time. I'll repeat this phrase: situational challenges vary across events and within the same event across time. Another thing that we can we do know, is that all traits and behaviors have both benefits and costs. I could talk for hours about this point alone, because we see this throughout the animal kingdom. All of the things that animals and humans do that are beneficial have costs. All the things that have costs can sometimes be beneficial. Here are a few examples in humans. If we think about coping and emotion regulation, say something like distraction or emotional suppression. These are considered avoidant processes. They're considered maladaptive, but in some situations, they are actually very useful, and there's good research to support this. Similarly, if we consider what things that we tend to think are highly adaptive, like reframing or reappraisal, finding meaning, gaining support from other people, these are certainly adaptive behaviors, adaptive abilities to have. But in some situations, they don't work very well. And in some situations, they can even be harmful. And again, there's good research to support this. It's a kind of a ubiquitous conclusion across animal species. So what this tells us then, the sort of the point that's staring us in the face, is that what works in one situation may not be effective or even harmful in another situation or another point in time. And when we average across events, that's why the effects are small. That's why something only contributes a little bit. It may work sometimes and not others. And this is a really important point. What works in one situation may not be as effective or even harmful in another situation or in another point in time. Now, then we get to our third point, which was really the beginning of this talk. Most people show resilience. So we can assume then that most people must work this out somehow. And in other words, the way people do this would be to work out the right strategy for the right situation at the right time. There's a great quote from Aristotle going way back that's very similar to this point in his Nicomedean Ethics, which that sounds like I'm really smart that I know that, but I only know that because somebody told me that. It's entertaining to read, but it's a lot of work. So we know that resilient people must be doing something like this, but this actually leads to my third point, which is that resilience requires flexibility. This is essentially flexibility. And so we can look at what flexibility is and how resilient people do this. Back in 2004, I did my first studies of flexibility. This was a study actually of people who were in or near the World Trade Center towers in New York on 9/11, when those towers were brought down by terrorists. And our study of those people found that people who could both show a lot of emotion, but also suppress their emotion, in doing both, showing emotion and suppressing emotion, those people had the best outcome. It was the ability to go back and forth between those behaviors. More recently, we put this together into a model of flexibility, which I want to tell you about right now. And this we call this regulatory flexibility or flexible self-regulation. I'll walk you through these pieces. There's a lot to it. Both of these pieces basically cover the motivation and the mechanism. We need to be motivated to do this, and we need to understand the mechanism behind it. The motivational part is something I call the flexibility mindset. And this is really a lot like optimism, like coping self-efficacy, or a sense of confidence in our coping abilities, and what we call challenge appraisals, focusing on the challenge rather than staying focused on the threat. Tell ourselves the future will be okay, I have the skills, I'll do what is necessary. Essentially, I will manage this. It's hurt, it's painful, I don't like it, I wish it didn't happen, but I will manage this. And that conviction, that mindset, is enormously helpful in being flexible, because it is a bit of work. We have to, we're dealing with something unpleasant, but we have to kind of look it square in the eye and deal with it in order to figure out how to get past it. So this conviction, our research shows, is a big part of doing that. And then we get to the mechanism, the way we actually do it. I'll walk you through this very quickly. We can talk about it more if anybody's interested. There's three parts. First, we have what's called context sensitivity. And this is when we focus on what's happening right now in the situation we're in, not the big broad situation, my life is a mess, everything's a mess. That's not what we're focusing on. We're focusing on what's happening right now. I'm anxious, I can't focus, I'm having nightmares, or I'm too tired. Whatever the problem is, we focus on that problem, we evaluate it, and we set a goal. What's happening to me and what do I need to do? Once we do that, we focus on what we need to do. We then move to the next step, which we call repertoire. And here, instead of thinking, what do I need to do, we're asking ourselves, what am I able to do? What can I do? And we use repertoire because essentially we're selecting a strategy here from our toolbox, from the strategies that we know we can use. What are these? What can I actually do? We figure out what's happening, what we need to do. We decide on what we're going to do to try to address that problem. And we come to the very important third step, which we call feedback. And here we simply ask ourselves, is this working? And this seems kind of simple. If it's working, we keep doing it. If it's not working, we try something else. But this is where many people fail, because they try something, they're bothered by something and they're struggling and they try to cope with it and it doesn't work. And people then many people assume they're not able to cope, and they either give up or they just assume they don't have the ability. But it's very much human. It's very much animal to cope through trial and error. Even the healthiest people, even the most resilient people, must cope by trial and error, because we basically take a guess as what the best strategy is, and it doesn't always work. Nothing works every time, so we try something else. So this is a very important part of the sequence. And we might have to try different strategies several times. If that still doesn't work, then we go back to the beginning and we rethink what it is we're trying to focus on. That's the gist of it. That's the basic plan of this model. So just to reiterate, resilience is common. It takes more than a few traits. It takes this flexibility process that I just described. I'm just going to thank the people. I've been very lucky in my career to be well funded, and I thank all those people, and I thank you very much for your time and attention.
Hey, wonderful. That is a brilliant, comprehensive overview of the flexibility and the resilience paradigm, George. Just a no-brainer, and allow me to start with the first question and giving some people in the audience the time to reflect or to prepare maybe for a question in a minute. Now, when we're doing these webinars, we often talk about post-traumatic events, as you said, potential traumatic events, or of studies when the event has happened, when it's over. And when we started this meeting, in the first minutes before we started at 8 o'clock, we said, hey, there's now a couple of missiles again being thrown over Ukraine. So Ukraine is a country that is in ongoing situations of threat and alertness and danger. And how about these principles? Can they be, quote unquote, applied or so for where there's sustained ongoing threat, trauma, potential trauma, and safety? Could you just reflect how your research contributes to maybe a set of principles or wisdom to sustain resiliency?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, Eric, and right on the money, actually. So the research shows us, I think, pretty well that when there's sustained stress, sustained adversity, repeated challenging events, repeated potentially traumatic events, this most definitely wears us out. We're not actually, one could argue that our mind-body system is designed for acute stress. We have a great stress response system, but our stress response system, like much in our bodies, becomes dysregulated to some extent when it's continually in use. So it's not uncommon for people struggling with long-term adversity to have ongoing difficulties, sleep difficulties, somatic complaints, problems that don't have a clear source, physical problems, etc., psychological problems. And what we see in the research is that people can keep on moving forward, but they're not going to be completely like symptom-free and healthy when there's chronic adversity. However, many people are able to continue on doing that. The flexibility idea applies fully during that time, absolutely fully during that time, because it's in a sense more than more needed then than ever, because there's a series of challenges and an endless series of challenges. And the challenges, the context sensitivity stage at the beginning is always really interesting and always critical, because the question is what's happening and what do I need to do? And sometimes the answer to that question is not so specific, just I'm stressed out, I am not doing well, I need to find a way to get this off my mind for even an hour if I have the luxury of an hour, so it may be a choice like that. I need to do something to give myself a break, or I need to do something to figure out what I'm feeling. I need to talk with someone or get some information. Whatever that challenge is, and that challenge will vary greatly when there is chronic stress. And all the famous hero stories, they always are confronting one after another of slings and arrows that come their way, and I think that's really the challenge. But we definitely, I think the key with the flexibility is that we break it down to what's happening right now, and I'll deal with that, and I'll deal with something else tomorrow. So it definitely applies.
Thank you. Let's listen to the questions from the audience. That's mostly the most important part of this. Please reach out. I do see one question in the chat, Irina, which I can read, which is in English. It's from Anna Kotirva, right? Would Anna Kotirva open the mic and read out the question? Please go ahead.
Hello. I would like to ask, is it possible that somebody with personality disorder, like antisocial or psychopath, can have PTSD?
Please, before you answer, can you say where you're calling in from, Anna? We'd just like to know sort of regional attendance.
Excuse me, what did you say?
Where you're calling in from? From where are you from now?
Now I'm in Poland.
Okay, thank you.
You're
Okay,
welcome.
George.
Can somebody with an antisocial personality or of that ilk have PTSD? I'm not by any stretch an expert in that, in answering in the knowledge needed to answer that question. Although when I was doing my clinical training, I worked with a lot of people with PTSD, and there were definitely a few people in that mix with antisocial personality disorder. So I don't know from experience, I would say yes. I don't know beyond that. I'm sorry, I don't have the expertise to really answer that question in any more, authoritative way.
Okay, do you know maybe something like researches about it?
I do not actually. I'm sorry, I do not. Yeah, it's just not an area that I've focused on.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Rina, you have your hand raised, please.
Так, дякую. Я бачу питання.
Yes, thank you. I also saw a question from Vitaly Christenko. Vitaly, would you like to voice your question? We'll be happy to hear you.
Please, yeah.
Greetings. My question is, so PTSD as the result of some combat activities in a soldier and in a civilian who just happened to be somewhere in the combat area but is not a combatant. Is it the same type of PTSD or are there any differences?
That's a great question. I think PTSD is probably very similar across people. How they react to it and what they do with it would, I think, be different, and very different in individuals. I think soldiers are very well trained for, in many cases, very well trained for what they're going through, and they manage PTSD in an ongoing way when they, as best they can. Many civilians, I think, become particularly confused by PTSD because of their own their minimal knowledge of it, and it's also in the context of where and when it happens. When we are struggling for our lives, we're very good at putting these, whatever we're struggling with, aside until we have a chance to deal with it. And that may or may not be the case. It may be different. It may be the case in two different soldiers may have different reactions to PTSD as well. So and the same thing with two different civilians. And civilians and soldiers, there may be a civilian who reacts very similar to the way a soldier does. So I think the PTSD itself is fairly uniform in terms of how it actually manifests, intrusive thoughts, nightmares, heightened arousal, these things we know well, but it's what people do with that and how they experience it, that's really the difference. And that's a big difference, I think.
Thank you. Could you just say where you were calling in from for this question? Where were you calling in from?
Mr. Kharkiv, Ukraine. The city of Kharkiv in Ukraine.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we go to the next question, Irina, if I may. Julia Horuk, you raise your hand. Could you read your question or speak your question and say where you're calling in from?
Доброго вечора.
Greetings. Now I am in Slovakia, but I am from Odessa. My question is the following. Now I work with Ukrainian children who fled as the result of the war, the invasion. So my question is, are there any research which researched PTSD in children, but the children respond differently from adults? And if yes, how do children cope? Because I see many children who experience also PTSD. So how can we help them?
Yes, that's another great question. I mean, when we've tracked people over time and we look at the different patterns over time, we tend to see a lot of similarities in children and adults in terms of just the symptom levels and patterns. And that's really when we see differences, it typically is in the types of events. When children have PTSD, I think it's similar to, I would answer that somewhat similar to the way that I answered the previous question. And I don't do a lot of work with children, so please take this as a caveat that children may be having intrusive thoughts and nightmares and this sense of arousal that adults have, except it could be very frightening for children, especially frightening because they don't know what's happening. The nightmares, all these things may be heightened for children. On the other hand, children have been remarkably resilient in many ways. And they find ways to distract themselves and to get things off their mind that sometimes adults are unable to do. So sometimes they cope better than adults. When people have PTSD, as I said before, I think the mechanisms, the biological responses, the way the immune system and the stress system work is the same in children and adults. Although again, it's how it manifests in their lives and what they do with it. So I think it's so idiosyncratic, we couldn't actually generalize. There may be a child who's extremely good at negotiating with these things and another child who's overwhelmed by the fear. So again, it really depends, I think, within the category, even on the person.
Thank you for bringing up that question, Julia.
Дякую вам.
Thank you.
Thank you, George.
Let's move to Konstantin. Konstantin, could you read your question or phrase your question and just say
yes.
Where are you calling in from, Konstantin?
Good evening. I'm calling from Ukraine. My question is about the returnees, military returnees, the POWs that was tortured and have PTSD and many disorders, like, for example, the personality disorder, and about I would like to ask about them.
Okay. Are you a famous actor, by the way? Am I looking at the
I
right
wish I'd be.
I think, I've been known to say that human beings can cope with anything. And I think that's really true. Human beings have shown high levels of resilience to just about anything. If there is an exception, and I don't know if this is true or not, it is torture. I think torture is one of the worst things anybody can go through. because as we all know, it's intentional and it's done with such a kind of it's such a dark aspect of life. And I think there is some research on torture that was, it's not perfect research because it was done on soldiers by their own military as a test, but it really does destabilize a person's capacity to even think clearly. And I think it probably has very lasting effects. So I don't know if anyone's ever been able to get good enough data to make this point, but I'm going to guess that the soldiers who have been tortured are going to need a lot of care and a lot of gentle care to get past it. And of course, I don't think it would be every soldier, but and I have met people who have been tortured who have coped extremely well and have been told me that, and I've seen it in them that they've coped extremely well. But I think I think I would, if I was working with somebody who was tortured, I would be more inclined to assume that they're going to need a lot of help than I would otherwise. That's probably the simplest way to put that.
Probably have ideas what kind of help they will have.
Good question.
What kind of?
Well, yeah, good question. I mean, I think there are so many tools we have at our disposal, and I guess it would mean, the most clinically appropriate tools. I mean, there is talking and working through whatever they experienced, which would, be something like a modified exposure, prolonged exposure, which would, I think, help. That would be particularly difficult, no doubt, because of the way of just how disturbing the events would be, both for the patient coming back, the POW, and for anyone working with them, yourself or anybody else. And there are also other tools that we know of. There are many tools for relaxation tools, and which actually are quite efficacious. These systematic relaxation and et cetera. And there are tools using working memory, as a way to help people just clear their minds. I think probably trusting other people will be a very, very hard thing. So the therapy whatever's available to help people, to regain a sense of trust in their fellow human beings. And that I don't know so much about, but I think there must be methods, that help with that. I think that would particularly be a weak spot, or a spot needing some assistance.
Thank you. I see 3 hands, and I think.
Thank you.
Thank you for that important question and the follow-up, Konstantin. 3 questions, and we'll go to the next presenter, who's also raising her hand, and we'll use that as a cliffhanger, a bridge, which will be used by Irina to introduce you, Gelena. But let me first, two others, if I may. Irina Korolets, I see you're writing. Could you make your question clear, Irina? Yes, go ahead. Go ahead. Where are you calling in from?
I'm in Berlin at the moment, but originally I'm from Donetsk region. I wanted to clarify, so when we talk about people who've experienced traumatic situations, it seems to me that we have people in mind who experienced these events in the past, and they're in the middle of recovery. However, Ukrainians are relentlessly experiencing these traumatic events with air raid sirens, with attacks. So wouldn't resilience interfere with the defense mechanisms? Because, these mechanisms are somewhat different. So I think that actually people mostly adapted, and their adaptation is ignoring things. It's not about resilience in my mind. So my question is, doesn't that go against resilience? Doesn't resilience go against the defense mechanisms?
Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by resilience. Resilience is just simply how people are doing. Okay, that's the outcome. The thing that I was talking about and that I focus on that brings people to that healthy outcome is flexibility. Okay, And the flexibility, as I described it, is about dealing with the challenges and the problems moment by moment as we're confronted with them. So as you said, ignoring things, just being distracted, keeping it far from your mind is actually very healthy. Nothing is healthy all the time. So there's got to be times and places to do other things. But it's all about the challenge. If people are feeling challenged, feeling a problem at hand, then they cope with that problem at hand in whatever way they can. I lost you. Your rectangle just moved somewhere, so I can't see you anymore. Oh, there you are. So it's really about doing whatever's needed in the moment. That's what, and that sequence of steps is what I was describing as flexibility. That's what would get people through the ongoing situation. And the motivational part as well, one needs that more than ever in a sense when there's ongoing stress. I will get through this. This will end eventually and I'll get through it. What do I need to do right now, right? And so if people are able to keep something at bay, there are other problems where they might worry, in the quiet moments, and maybe that's what they can deal with. And it doesn't. There's no prescription for, say, focusing on the event and working it through in the traditional sense. There's no prescription for that at all. It's really about the challenge you face moment by moment and what you can do that's going to most likely address it. And if it doesn't work, try something else. That sequence is what gets us through prolonged stressors.
Thank you for taking us out of the quote unquote resiliency paradigm to the flexibility paradigm, if I may make that stretch, right? Flexibility is the buzz, so to speak. Yes.
Yes.
One last question, and then if I may, Irina, and then we'll move to the second presenter from Olena. Please, I saw your hand. Please, you're the last before we go to Gelena. Go ahead, raise your question, please.
Good evening. So in your talk, you mentioned context sensitivity, strategy choice, and other mechanisms. You also said that the third mechanism is the most problematic. So is it possible at that exact moment that special tools or techniques are used that could help the person to find the right way out at this third stage, the feedback stage, that is?
Great question. When I said it was most problematic, just to clarify, I meant that it's difficult for many people. And I think that one way to address that would be really through education about it. The knowing that it's possible to correct and try something else. I think that for whatever reason, a lot of people don't think that way. Maybe because of the way information is presented in the media, I don't know. But I think teaching people, helping people realize that they can try something else. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that they failed. It just means that nothing works every time. So that's one obvious way to do that. Another thing that it's in the midst of great difficulties, it's hard to learn new tricks. It's hard to learn new things. So when I teach people about this flexibility sequence in a workshop or something, I might instruct people to try this out in their daily lives as much as they can to get used to it. So in the midst of a crisis, then the best you can do, I think, is to talk to people about trying something else. It's okay. And I think that's very simple, but I think that is the crux of it, is that it's okay for something not to work and to try something else. You can tell people, for example, everybody is obsessed with AI right now, artificial intelligence, but that's how artificial intelligence works. It tries and tries again, right? It works by learning. And the smallest creatures on Earth work by learning. They work by learning. They figure things out through trial and error. So it's really trial and error. And if we're struggling with something, there's enough time to try something else, right? And even sometimes, many times, keep trying, but eventually something works. So I think that's the best I could say about that. I think that would be, that would be a very helpful thing to do with people.
A very brief follow-up, and then we're. Is there a
Дякую.
relation between flexibility and
Thank you.
intelligence? Has there
Is
ever
there a relationship between flexibility and intelligence? That's a damn good question. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Well, when we have tested people, we've only done this a little bit, we find that the majority of people are at least moderately flexible. And I think that that suggests, it's a common ability. There are lots of, there are a lot of very intelligent people who are not flexible. And then there are a lot of people that would say uneducated, or I don't know about intelligence, but there are people we might not consider the most intelligent people in the world who are flexible. So I don't know, there's probably some small correlation, but I think it's really life experience, maybe more than intelligence.
Okay, thank you so much, George, and thank you for all your questions. This is really why we do this, to hear your voices, to have the expert respond to your questions, and we would like to do the same with the next presenter. And I may invite Irina to introduce the second presenter, Irina, and then we'll move to Ukrainian language, George. So we have to switch the button, and then we can listen in.
I switched the button. Okay.
Irina, you may
button switch.
Please.
Так, я маю честь представити.
That's right. I am honored to introduce my colleague, Gelena Lazos. She is a Dean of Psychology, Chair and Head of the Department of the Psychology at Sigmund Freud University Ukraine. She's a scholar, and she's also a practitioner, a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. And I am excited to give the floor to Gelena. She will share her expertise in real casework in Ukraine. Over to you, Gelena. Irina, thank you. And I thank the organizers for having me. I think this is a critical topic. Also, I'd like to express my gratitude to Professor George Bonanno. Your works, George, were important for me and for my studies. Now I'm trying to share my slides. A moment. Right. Lovely. Yes, I did it, Irina. As I was preparing for this meeting, I was reflecting on what I could possibly share with you that late in 20 minutes, something that would be valuable. I see so many familiar faces, the brilliant colleagues, professional psychotherapists, and I think their level of awareness is extremely high. Moreover, I struggled focusing on the topic that I would like to expand on today, because resilience for any mental health professionals is something I've been addressing since the war broke out back in 2016. So I was looking at psychotherapists who, beginning from 2014, stood up to the challenge, and they began this strenuous work with the Ukrainian soldiers. We looked at factors that determines the mental health professionals' resilience and their well-being, and resilience factors generally, and also how attachment styles and object relations influence the resilience of the mental health professionals. Since I'm a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, I also looked at the promise of psychoanalysis in building resilience. So, Today, I decided to share my reflections with you today. And also, I'll briefly touch upon resilience techniques that help build resilience for the psychotherapists at times of war. War has drastically changed psychological and psychotherapeutic worldview and has had an impact on the entire paradigm of psychological support. Stress as a result of war overshadow any other type of stress. When a war engulfed a 40 million developed country, everything has changed, from day-to-day work to professional and work processes that were established long ago. The entire population of the country is in trauma, including psychologists and psychotherapists and their clients. Having survived during the most difficult days of the Russia's full-scale invasion, mental health professionals of various branches, family, children's or school psychologists, psychotherapists, including Gestalt psychologists and psychoanalysts, became actively engaged in the field work, even people who had very little experience. This slide shows my colleagues. They worked in bomb shelters, in train stations, in the internally displaced persons centers. I think all of us have been there and have seen how difficult this work is. It is common knowledge that overcoming psychological trauma depends on how the victims were supported by the psychologists or psychotherapists, who in turn can adequately address the struggles of such work and endure intense traumatic material of the clients. Empathic engagement in a human relationship with the victim who is trying to overcome trauma causes change in the internal experience of the psychologist. So this professional cannot prevent their own negative experience in this type of interaction, because the professionals need to empathize with the suffering, and therefore some difficult conditions or reactions or simply high stress levels arise. So these emotional conditions are rampant when the society is in crisis or is at war. The number of victims that require psychological support increases dramatically, whereas mental health support is often provided by volunteers and it is done in very intense mode. So, at the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion has led the mental health professionals transformed position. So the paradigm changed, and the invasion also caused a change in the relationship between the therapist and the client. And it highlighted the need in supporting and building professionals' resilience, because the state of the professionals would define the quality of mental health services.
So these external factors have led to the transformation of the whole approach. The lack of neutral approach, psychoanalysts would understand what I mean here. The changes in the setting, some places which safe were no longer safe. The motivation and the actual requests from the client, they mostly are different now, and the requests from the clients now require a different approach to the provision of care or the change in the position of the specialists. Sometimes the psychotherapists, they actually become the caregivers. And also the professional orientation of the specialists has changed. Everyone became a crisis psychologist and trauma therapist. If you talk about the internal factors in the transformation of this relationship, I would say that now in this relationship, both the psychologist or psychotherapist and the client are traumatized. So the main idea on the provision of care, psychological care, is the following. The specialist must be a few steps ahead of the client because of their awareness and experience. So they have to be a reliable object for the client and broadcast a reasonable and truthful position. So resilience and maintaining the mental health of the specialists in mental health are a very important issue and a very important challenge at the moment. So in my research, I based not only on theoretical papers, but also I reflected my conditions and the conditions of my colleagues and friends when we were experiencing tragic circumstances in this war. To summarize, all the definitions of resilience show that the phenomenon of resilience is one of the main resources and one of the main potentials in the human psychic, which ensure its stability in overcoming stress. Resilience depends on many internal and external factors. And indeed, we've heard from the previous speaker that there are many of those factors. The self-reflection and positive attitude and the freedom of will are the decisive for survival in the times of the catastrophes and disasters. Professor Bonanno says that behavioral adaptation, the flexibility, is an ongoing process and it requires self-regulation at all the levels of functioning. And I think that indeed we can really see that when the trauma of the war require being experienced right now, this day, because we never know when the war is over. We have to live in this indefiniteness. So if we talk about the general approach on the development of resilience in among mental health specialists, we should maintain the professional stance and the specialist's identity and supporting the ecology of the specialist's own ego. So in Ukraine, as a psychotherapist and as a researcher, I did lots of self-reflection and I felt all these processes within. The process of development of resistance consists of several components: resources, stabilization and adaptation, and the narcissistic balance or self-esteem, self-respect. So there are psychotechnologies to ensure the specialists in mental health can develop resilience. In this slide, I tried to outline these components: the resources, stabilization, adaptation, and the self-respect. The resources being the positive, wholesome feeling of oneself that gives one's personality the ability to maintain strength and wholesomeness in spite of danger and disintegration. The adaptation is the evolutionary process through which the organism is able to better live in its habitat. And stabilization is strengthening, acquiring resilience and continuity, and this narcissistic self-respect. Well, I think you managed to read and we don't have much time, so I think I should move on. So the resources, the main precondition to start the process of this psychological recovery after trauma is the creation of safety and resources. The symptoms of traumatized clients and their traumas of the specialists which haven't been lived through become the source of triggers which trigger the ongoing re-traumatization. And it's through the internal and external resources the personality can get this resilience. But the resources are finite. So every specialist must find its own source to replenish the resource. It can be different practices, breathing practices, meditation, religious practices, sport, therapy, and different methods of therapeutic support, art therapy, body-oriented therapy, mindfulness, and so on. So in order to assess the resource component, I would suggest to use the techniques and methods through which one can balance the personal and professional life and get the additional recharge at different levels, including the spiritual one, and to stabilize one's condition. So as an example, there is this wheel of life balance, or the life pie, as it's also called. It's an interesting parallel with the resilience pie, which George has shown in the beginning. So the starting point in this can be the creation of the inventory of especially its own resources at different personal, behavioral, social, and spiritual level. So to diagnose oneself, they can use this diagnostic exercise, the wheel of life, but they check if they have the actual balance between the personal priorities and professional, between the different aspects, to make sure that they give attention to all the aspects. Also, the psychologists and psychotherapists might find this exercise useful, the sacred moment, which is useful regardless of the actual religion. This exercise, the sacred moment, can really lead one to the transcendent state, which gives this research, which gives the recharge and recovery. This technique can help one regain the meaning of life and the meaning of professional activity. So in this technology to develop the resilience of the specialists, colleagues often describe that this sacred moment is indeed a moment that gives the resource to live, and it often is accompanied by the feeling of gratitude, and it is extremely useful in the situation when the feeling of despair overwhelmed the meaning of work. This exercise helped deal with one's own imperfection and helped regain the motivation. Another component, the adaptation and stabilization. This is a component in the development of resilience. So the resource help with adaptation and stabilization. And the main objective here is to create this space for effective work and life. What is helping with adaptation? Expert knowledge, one's own experience of psychotherapy, the understanding of one's own identity, the feeling of one's professional identity, supervision, support, organizational support, understanding of one's own limitation, and the training on adaptation modeling. Adaptation can be achieved through the restoration of internal and external control and achieving the balance of life and getting this resource recharge, which I mentioned before. The psychologists and psychotherapists, on the basis of their specialized knowledge and their own experience in the last 2.5 years, have adapted to the environment, and the first results of my research confirm that. The application of different defensive techniques, the feeling of one's personal identity, create a reliable platform to balance the condition. It's important to understand the limits of one's own competences here. If a specialist is not professionally equipped to work with trauma or has a very intensive schedule of seeing the patient, they have to stop, they have to pause, they have to refer the clients to some more trained colleagues, because we have to protect our ego, I would say. Yeah, we have to take care about its ecology. And this is a quotation by my colleague and teacher, Yulia Medinska. I think it's very, very crucial. It's about the position which we have to have in this stage. Feeling one's limits and the verge between the masochistic sacrificiality and the feeling of effective work with the resource is an important element of taking care of one's personal and professional ego. So indeed, we need to strengthen our professional position. Even highly qualified specialists sometimes cannot process the whole array of external and internal information. So what's extremely important is to go to the supervision and reflection groups. In these groups, the specialists can process their own feelings and the feelings of their clients, can observe the general trends in Ukraine and in the client trends, and get support. For example, for me personally, in the first 9 months of the full-scale invasion, what was really helpful was this large international group of psychotherapists headed by Professor Alexander Heltz. When I had to flee to a different country, I was going every day to the humanitarian hub, and I was helping with the packing of the medication, and I was providing psychological care there, because professional identity was my basis. It really helped me, and this also was the subject of my first article on that experience. I named it "The Psychoanalyst in the lab coat of the warehouse worker," because I was trying to reflect on my experiences. And I also would like to highlight the importance of supervision support, because indeed in the professional development, supervision is one of the very important methods. And now, when the specialists in mental health experience significant pressure and workload, the supervision functions are even more expanded. It helps understand one's own professional peculiarities, find the limits in professional activity, and supervision transforms the understanding, informs the opportunities and skills to help further develop this professional identity. And there are different effective formats, the group or personal supervision. So very briefly, I would like to share a little bit of data and to compare. The first research after 2014, it was actually in 2018. It said that the secondary stress and the burnout syndrome is directly related to the availability of the supervision support, in the specialists. And the table shows that the indicator of getting ongoing supervision support was the most relevant to show the negative correlation between the secondary stress and burnout. So the secondary stress and burnout, well, is found in those who do not have the ongoing supervision support. And supervision support was mostly received in this ratio. This was my first study in 2018. 63% had minimum volume of supervision support under 15 hours. And we can compare this to the modern data which we've received in 2024. The group of researchers was different. We studied evidence-based methods in psychotherapy, and you probably know Ms. Yana Velikodnya, who was heading the group. I would like to draw the attention to this data because it's well, it's based on different methodology, and there was a different objective in this data collection. But I think it's important, and it's still possible to compare and see the trend, of what is happening in these 10 years of the war. Those who did not have supervision experience at all, it's under 10%. And 35% had up to 50 hours of supervision support. So people, the specialists get more supervision support. So I would like to highlight that supervision is only one of the methods in professional development, but it's important to prevent the secondary traumatic stress and the burnout syndrome, and to develop the resilience of the psychologists. And lastly, and a cross-cutting component, the narcissistic balance or self-respect. Why is it cross-cutting? Because it has a cross-cutting role in the preservation of personal and professional identity. The components of the process of resilience development have it in its core. Properly balanced self-respect plays one of the most crucial roles in the adaptation to stress, and it creates the opportunities to master a wide spectrum of psychological defenses and coping behaviors, and facilitates the development of resilience. And in this slide, I try to provide the psychological, not psychoanalytical look on self-respect, on the self-concept. And the narcissistic regulation covers the aspects, the self-concept, self-worth, the feeling of one's own self-esteem and correspondence and belonging, the experience of being full of guilt, full of shame, and being improper. Well, it's usually means the lack of self-respect regulation, and Mr. Menses has covered that very well in his research. This system in one's psyche is usually attacked the most, and it happens when we have to make a choice in our life, when we are under threat of the destruction of self-worth and self-respect.
So Manthus suggested 3 pillars: superego, encompassing conscience, morale, ethics, etc. Second pillar, internal world, internalized ideas about the world, culture, tradition. and everything that is in line with unconscious choice motivation. And the third pillar is ego ideal, the psyche, the embodied ego. And these pillars are being pummeled, and that can lead to complete self-deprecation, because at the same time, the senses are reappraised. The values are redressed, as self-values also reappraised. Choices: should I leave Ukraine or should I stay at home? Or looking for answers on important questions: who we are now. Do we work in stockpiles as volunteers, crisis psychologists, social workers, refugees? What is the scope of our competencies? Are we bringing any? Are we being helpful at all? Are we being effective facing the amount of grief and trauma? Are we decent people? Are we decent citizens? All of that affects the resiliency of professional ego and our self-respect. Sometimes there are no answers, or people aren't sure that the answers are true, and that can be detrimental to ego and our self-respect. Okay, how can you help that? What's helpful? Taking care of your body, professional and ego, life-work balance, nurturing resources, feeling your own boundaries, excelling professionally, also support groups, professional reflection and supervision is a must. All of that helps to regulate narcissistic balance, drives the professional's resilience. This prevents the conditions associated with secondary traumatic stress. And during resilience building training sessions for professionals, I suggest at this specific stage to use two tools. Tool one, personal mission declaration. Actually, there are so many highbrow words that, but this is an exercise and it helps you focus on the tasks at hand, on routine things. And second tool is the letter from the great supervisor. I think each of us has this internalized object of the teacher, of a supervisor, somebody who's a big authority for us. And we address ourselves a letter from him or from her. And this letter would support our self-respect, our professional resilience. Thank you so much for listening. Gelena, thank you. Thank you for this sensitive presentation that brings together your personal experience and your professional experience. Unfortunately, George must leave the meeting because he has other commitments. This doesn't mean, however, that we stop this very second. We would be excited to hear some feedback from our colleagues. And we open up the floor to possible questions or maybe reflections. And let me start personally. I sensed this internal Helena's voice. Irina, you really need to go to the supervision session. And I'm very grateful to you. Irina, I miss you at my supervisions. That's true, Helena. Helena and I, we have participated for many years with analytic supervision, and once I had to leave the group, but this indeed is a very important source of support. And yeah, I believe it was a very honest and it was a very generous presentation where we heard a host of different techniques. And since we record the meetings, you might rewatch or refresh some of the knowledge. Irina, thank you so much. Eric, maybe you have some feedback or maybe questions for Helena. What was your perception of the talk?
Yeah, thank you. I was puzzling. And yes, indeed, George Bonanno had to leave. He informed us that he couldn't stay for the whole webinar, so it was not disinterested, but he already informed us that there was a cut that he had to take. My question was actually to throw in, but maybe just a reflection on your end to your wonderful presentation, Gelena, is the topic. We could have a whole session on the topic of bereavement. You know, as you're well aware of, so many losses have to be faced, and how these principles of flexibility, either behavioral or cognitive, can erode so much values that are important for our ego, for our narcissistic ego, that can erode such that this bereavement becomes too big and too massive, that eats us up in a way. Just your reflection. I was listening with the eye or the ear of bereavement as a phenomenon that I think so many people here in our webinar will be facing. What your thoughts or reflections would be, how these principles of resiliency or flexibility could be applicable or helpful to deal with the issue of bereavement.
Well, my first reply would be that, granted, we have to seek effective means to support, first and foremost, the professionals that would subsequently provide these mental health services. And this is why I researched this group. You know, as the airplane safety instruction goes, first the mother needs to put on the mask, the oxygen mask, and then she needs to put it on her child. It's a comparison maybe not particularly apt, but plenty of challenges are in store for us, and there's great uncertainty. We don't know what's coming when the war is over. We simply do not know that. With bereavement, with grief, and with trauma. Ahead, it's something we would have to find ways of addressing and tools to build resilience in mental health professionals, psychologists, psychotherapists, medical doctors, anyone who's a part of that effort. Eric, I also have a question, if I may. Helena, you said that this massive stress of war, uncertainty, the sense of helplessness, inability has an impact on all defense mechanisms practically. Maybe you've observed, Helena, as you were practicing, or you know from your colleagues, how are defense mechanisms changing right now? What's dynamics? What are the biggest? Irina, what I'm noticing is that compared to 2.5 years back, when this calamity happened, the war has been going on for 10 years. However, full-scale invasion broke out 2 years. But with all the events before the full-scale, people were alarmed a lot. And I have seen this in my colleagues. I've seen the scope of psychological defenses narrowed a great deal. What I'm seeing right now, and I take it as a sign of resilience, is that this scope grew much, much bigger. It's much larger now. In part, maybe it pertains to these flexible self-regulation, or it can be named as a lability. So they have much more ways to respond to a certain event. So broadening of that scope, I take as a very positive sign. Thank you, Helena. Natalie? Thank you so much, Irina, and thank you for an engaging talk. I was intrigued by the exercise that you briefly mentioned, the sacred moment, I think that was called, I don't remember exactly. Could you please expand on it a little bit? Natalie, this exercise is described in many work. It's by Goldstein, and he described this exercise back in 2017. I think what we could do is make use of our imagination, depending on your paradigm or orientation. For example, I'm a cognitive emotional psychotherapist, and I give this exercise in cognitive imaginative vein. I want my client to relax. If I see that the client doesn't relax, I just assist, and there are relaxation techniques in place. So I ask my clients to imagine a sacred moment, a moment of utmost importance that maybe it was in the past, maybe it's in the present, maybe it's going to happen in the future. So I ask my clients to imagine that, and I guide and accompany the client in that moment. I know quite a few professionals who are well versed in the mindfulness method. They have their own techniques. They're similar, but you need to grasp the principles that you need to make sure that your client is relaxed. You need to immerse the client in that image to see that the client fully experiences it with all the senses, so that the clients are fully more immersed in that moment. Helena, thank you. That's very interesting. I'm seeing a comment from Natalia Bilecka, and actually that matches our idea of the webinars, Eric, by the way. So it's not only a helpful webinar, not only is the interpretation good, and that's important, but it's also an educational meeting, but it also is therapeutic. And we have noticed it for a while now. Indeed, we see it as our important mission, and we are happy to see that Natalia looks forward to the following events, and so do we. And maybe this would be a good moment to wrap up the meeting today. And oh, I see that Julia raised her hand. Maybe after.
Last question to Julia, then Irina, and then indeed we should, because we understand that it's late and it's a long working day. But last question, please.
It's not so much of a question, but my appreciation to Helena for her presentation. You said that therapists are traumatized as well at the same time as the client. And clearly, we are aware of that, but sometimes we forget, we might forget. We are so intent on helping our clients that we might forget. So after we were reminded, we could exercise better self-care, and we could receive timely support of the therapist or the supervisor. So thank you once again for reminding us, because that prevents burnout and that helps us to work effectively, meaningfully, helping people and the clients. Thank you for your talk. Julia, thank you for your feedback. Thank you. I need to note, and it was mentioned today, that next time we are planning to meet up in the last Thursday of June, same time, and we will look at leadership in grief topic. We invited a colleague who has presented at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Eric Dessois from Belgium. He works extensively with the firefighters, with the first responders, and we would enhance our awareness and knowledge in this field. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your attendance, your participation, and your sustainability in this situation. We will keep doing this. We look forward to your presence, your attendance in 4 weeks. And if you just open your videos, that we can see that there's all live people behind those screens. And that's always a wonderful moment that we see there's no bots or so, but there's real people. And we can wave to each other to get our oxytocin burst and boost that will carry us on for the next day or a couple of days. And stay healthy, and Slava Ukraina, and hope you will all be healthy. And thank you for being with us tonight.